Alright, so a world-renowned classical composer walks into a bar and meets one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. Have you heard this one before? Oh yes, I'm talking about the night when Igor Stravinsky, the Russia-born composer famous for his scandalous 1913 ballet, The Rite of Spring, came to a performance by Charlie Parker, the saxophonic genius who's more or less become the face of jazz as we know it. Wait, like, that wasn't even a joke, like there wasn't a punchline, it wasn't even funny. Whatever, it's a cool story, okay? It goes like this. Parker's quintet is playing at Birdland. They walk on stage, and Parker's trumpeter recognizes Stravinsky in the front row. The trumpeter tells Parker, who does not look at Stravinsky. Instead, he starts playing a particularly fast rendition of Coco. And at the beginning of his second chorus, he quotes the opening of Stravinsky's Firebird. Stravinsky roars with delight, pounding his glass on the table, sending liquor onto the people behind him. But Parker still doesn't look at Stravinsky. Instead, he quickly wraps up the tune and goes on with his own tune called Bird of Paradise. This is like one of the most legendary encounters in the history of 20th century music. You've got two figures who stand at the center of their musical spheres coming together for an ecstatic moment of musical exchange. It joins the ranks of Tolstoy meeting Dostoevsky, Hegel seeing Napoleon riding on horseback, Elon Musk drinking Diet Coke with Jeff Bezos in 2004. But the thing about the Stravinsky-Parker legend is that it is, at the end of the day, just a legend. Let me explain. So the story supposedly takes place in 1951, but it wasn't actually published until around 2002. By that point, the book's author was in his late 60s, and he was recalling in really vivid detail an experience he would have had when he was, an angsty teen. Besides that one, there's no record of this event actually happening. There are no recordings from the performance, and neither Parker nor Stravinsky ever mentioned it. Other details from the anecdote don't quite add up, like the fact that the slow, brooding opening of Stravinsky's Firebird doesn't really fit a tune like Coco, which Charlie Parker was known for playing at breakneck speeds. Basically, the whole thing reads more like a neatly composed fiction than an accurate historical account. You've got Charlie Parker, who is nicknamed Bird, playing at Birdland, the club that had just been opened in his name, playing Stravinsky's Firebird, and then moving past it with his own tune called Bird of Paradise. It's all just a little too on the nose. On the beak? But yeah, it's true that Stravinsky moved to the US in the 30s and could have been at Birdland the night Charlie Parker was playing, and Parker could have played the Firebird at exactly that time. It's true that Parker studied, discussed, and quoted Stravinsky's music throughout his career. He's even said to have carried around scores of the Rite of Spring in his back pocket. But the story as you know it now probably isn't very true. But it also kind of is. I recently posted a sick meme video of a bunch of jazz musicians quoting the iconic opening bassoon line from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. You know, this one. And it just so happens that that video starts with a clip of Charlie Parker playing it in his 1949 recording of Salt Peanuts. For meme's sake, that video is just the one lick, but there are countless other Stravinsky licks embedded in classic jazz recordings. Just to stick with Charlie Parker for now, here's him quoting another part of the Rite of Spring, the Spring Auguries section, in 1949, echoing an arrangement done by Neil Hefti. You can hear that same lick played by a bunch of other jazz musicians. Coleman Hawkins, Paul Desmond, the list goes on and on. Even beyond the Rite of Spring, you can find a bunch of jazz quotes pulled from Petrushka, and even some of Stravinsky's more obscure works, like his 1945 Symphony in 3 Movements. The phenomenon actually dates back as far as 1927, when Bix Beiderbecke threw in a slick reference to the block chord sequence of Stravinsky's Petrushka. Long story short, the Parker-Stravinsky legend, whether or not it's true, doesn't represent an isolated event. It encapsulates a much broader trend among jazz musicians of taking influence from all kinds of places and incorporating other styles into their vocabulary. And when it comes to drawing from classical music, Stravinsky has always been a fan favorite.
Working on the Charlie Parker records, I would also sometimes put on the Rite of Spring.
Yeah, sure. Parker's lick could have been swapped out with one drawn from any other classical composer's music, and the story still would have been pretty believable. Like when Sonny Rollins quoted Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade 4 whole times in his solo on Love Letters. Or when Bill Evans uses those Ravel-like chords in Peace, Peace. Or when George Shearing based his rendition of It Never Entered My Mind off of Eric Satie's first Gymnopédie. In case you haven't noticed, I could do this all day long. But with Stravinsky in particular, jazz musicians have taken it even further than just borrowing a lick here and a gesture there. Since his death in 1971, there's been a consistent stream of full-fledged tributes to the composer's works, including by Hubert Laws, Alice Coltrane, Wynton Marsalis, and most recently the Bad Plus and Eric Hofbauer. Okay, so but why the special treatment for Stravinsky? Well, for one, he's the only classical composer I've mentioned who is still alive into the 1940s, when jazz was moving from blues and swing into bebop, free jazz, fusion, and other really experimental styles. More importantly, he's really the only major 20th century classical composer I've mentioned so far who engaged with jazz music and jazz ideas throughout his career. The story goes that after a friend brought him some jazz sheet music and, maybe a recording or two from the US in 1916, Stravinsky immediately got to work on his ragtime that would be featured in The Soldier's Tale. There were a couple other ragtime pieces in the 10s and 20s. Then in the 30s, there was the brief but charming Preludium for Jazz Ensemble. And then in the 40s came his longest and probably best known jazz work, the Ebony Concerto, a 3-movement concerto grosso that he wrote for Woody Herman's swing band. And then even after the Ebony Concerto, up until his death in 1971, Stravinsky would be identifying, quote, jazz influences in stuff that sounded nothing like jazz on the surface. From the beginning to the end of his career, there was some kind of fundamental compatibility Stravinsky saw between jazz and his own musical style. Despite inhabiting entirely different musical spheres, they were somehow speaking the same language.
I like very much this concert.
So what exactly was it about jazz music that gave Stravinsky the hots over and over again? And what exactly was it about Stravinsky's music that made it such a pervasive reference point among jazz musicians? Well, the most obvious similarity works like the Rite of Spring have with jazz is their use of jaunty, syncopated rhythms and a lot of brass. But there's more to it than that. I think that's a pretty simplistic and mildly racist place to leave things. I mean, the main musical distinction people often point to between classical music and jazz is that classical music is based in a European system of harmony and tuning, basically limited to the notes you see on a piano. Jazz, on the other hand, has its roots in the blues, which incorporates notes that lie in between the notes of a piano. Those are called blue notes. Blue notes and blues in general have their roots in African music. You can read about that here. And blue notes are what give jazz that signature expressiveness that you hear in recordings by, say, Bessie Smith. Stravinsky never exactly talked about blue notes as such, but he had a very interesting way of navigating harmony that kind of created a similar in-between effect. Let me show you what I mean. Probably the most famous element of the Rite of Spring, besides the opening bassoon call, is the repetition of the so-called right chord.
Was rather a new chord.
The chord is basically an E-flat 7 chord stacked on top of an E major, or Stravinsky spelled it F-flat major, but it's the same thing. Listen to it one more time.
I like very much this chord.
A lot of ink and probably blood has been spilled trying to figure out exactly what this chord is. Scholars have pointed to all kinds of fancy scales and combinations of chords to justify what's really downright weird. At the end of the day, it doesn't sound like a particular combination of notes or chords. To me, it sounds like one chord that's slightly out of tune. A chord that can't quite decide between E flat and E, that could ultimately land on either side, or somewhere in the middle. Jazz pianist Julian Joseph actually heard something similar, I think. In a recent video he did with The Guardian, he plays the right chord from memory, saying,
basically it's a dominant seventh.
He plays through some of the piece from memory and basically subs out a jazzy E-flat dominant sound everywhere Stravinsky actually wrote E-flat rubbing against E.
That gives it away, doesn't it? It's an E-flat major chord.
But you know, he could have played everything up a half step in E, and it still would have sounded just about as close to Stravinsky's original markings. After the Rite of Spring premiered, some critics actually acknowledged the weird way that Stravinsky could use clashing semitones to make that in-between sound, which to classical ears sounded plain wrong.
59 times the same chord. Diaghilev was a little bit surprised. He asked me, will it last a very long time this way? And I said, till the end, my dear.
And there are tons and tons of examples of this kind of clash in Stravinsky's music. Let me show you just one. This is from the first of his 3 pieces for string quartet. If you look at the score, the 2 violins could not be playing in more different keys. The first violin is spelling out G major, and the second violin is doing something like C sharp minor. Those scales on the page are a tritone away. Again, totally unrelated. A lot of theorists like to think of the 2 violins making a kind of octatonic scale, or half-whole scale. Half-whole because it ascends by alternating half steps and whole steps, and the B natural there is just to add a kind of G major flavor to the whole thing. But the piece doesn't sound octatonic to me, especially with the violins explicitly instructed to play way high up on their low G strings, where if you're a violinist, you know it's really hard to play with good intonation. The whole thing just sounds kind of off. I even know this one recording where the second violin lays it on so strong that the notes are actually out of tune. They actually sound less like F sharp, E, D sharp, C sharp, and more like their closer upper neighbors, G, F, E, and D. Heard that way, the 2 violins don't make any kind of funny octatonic scale, they actually just make a very simple mode of G major. But instead of committing to just one scale, or to 2 scales meant to be heard independently, Stravinsky has them rub up right next to each other in a way that makes them sound concertedly out of tune. It's almost like he knew the exact right way to have his musicians play inexactly. They're not quite blue notes, but they are skew notes?
Piano is, as you can hear, both dampened and quite out of tune. Visiting composers and musicians would like to try his piano, and they all were quite appalled to find it was out of tune. Didn't bother Stravinsky in the slightest.
Look, don't get me wrong, the 3 pieces for string quartet don't sound anything like jazz, nor does the Rite of Spring in a lot of places, despite what Leonard Bernstein had to say about it.
Prehistoric jazz.
And like I said, Stravinsky probably wasn't thinking about blue notes or anything like that while he was writing them. My point is that Stravinsky and jazz, even before either side might have realized it, were playing with very similar musical ideas at exactly the same time. And as it turns out, in the same locations. People often like to think of Stravinsky as the great Russian composer, but the fact is he left Russia when he was in his mid-20s and lived in France on and off for 30 years and eventually settled in the US, where he lived longer than anywhere else. It's important to realize that the Parker-Stravinsky legend really could have happened, even if it is pretty improbable. And the legend reveals another essential similarity between Stravinsky and jazz, the one that's actually let the conversation keep going for so long. That's let the legend of their encounter continue to circulate over half a century past Stravinsky's death. See, because the story I started this video with isn't really about Parker using blue notes or stealing Stravinsky's rhythms or even invoking the Firebird in particular. It's about Parker taking a melodic idea and translating it into his own language. That technique of taking any and all available material and repurposing it into your own idiom is a defining trait of both Stravinsky and jazz. Good artists borrow, great artists steal, You've probably heard that before. It's popularly attributed to Stravinsky among a ton of other people, and jazz musicians knew the concept all too well. Ella Fitzgerald even went as far as to say, "I steal everything I've ever heard." Basically, borrowing each other's ideas is what allowed Stravinsky and jazz to enhance their own. What might seem like appropriation was, between them, a kind of appreciation. Okay, so let me try this joke again and make it actually funny this time. Igor Stravinsky walks into a bar and meets not one jazz musician, but all of them. Every single one. Dead, alive, yet to be born, every single one of them, lining up out the door to meet Stravinsky. And the bartender says, "Gee, Igor, you've really brought in a nice crowd here, but you've been sitting here for days. How long are you gonna keep letting these jazz musicians buy you drinks?" And Stravinsky responds,
"To the end, my dear."
Why don't we look at the legend just one last time? Parker's quintet is playing at Birdland. The trumpeter recognizes Stravinsky, tells Parker. Parker doesn't look at Stravinsky. Parker goes on with a fast version of Coco, quotes the Firebird. Stravinsky goes nuts, and Parker just goes on, never once looking at Stravinsky, playing his own tune called Bird of Paradise. So now that you know the story behind this, thanks to my incredible walked into a bar joke, thank you very much. And you know that Parker knew Stravinsky's music well enough to bust out a lick at any moment, you might still wonder a couple things. Like, why does Parker never once look at Stravinsky? If he's admired the maestro so long, why would he let the moment pass so quickly? How is it that after decades of anticipation, of walking into the same bars and never meeting, Stravinsky and Parker finally meet and they don't even say a word to each other? I actually think it's a pretty accurate image of how Stravinsky and jazz truly interacted throughout the 20th century. Sure, they had a lot in common, but it's not like Stravinsky ever picked up a saxophone or Parker ever wrote a symphony. In a way, it's because they were part of such different musical traditions. They never knew which bar each other was at and when, that the two musical entities were able to cross paths so seamlessly and for so long. Stravinsky's music and jazz were both constantly taking on new forms and pushing new musical envelopes in their own way. Each always had something to be mined from the other without the need for them to directly collaborate, if that makes sense. You can basically think of Stravinsky and jazz as two parallel lines that never quite met, even if they were always running in the same direction. Thanks for sticking around. There's more where that came from. Don't be a stranger. Leave a note. So long.
I don't feel this prehistoric jazz. It's a kind of elephantine jazz. Very Russian, very... I don't feel the jazz, man. It runs.